Thanks, and I'll just go ahead and note, if you're interested in either looking at the script for this talk or the slides, you can access them on the URL currently on the screen. So, as rhetoricians interested in the study of digital media, we find ourselves increasingly interested in exploring the possibilities of those media, not so much to see what they allow us to perform with, or how to perform with them, but rather to see what we already do persuasively through them. That is, we want to take seriously the notion that we engage diverse audiences in the construction and manipulation of digital technologies. We propose to do this by examining the processes of software development related to and the code texts that comprise those technologies. So if we want to argue that rhetoric occurs in digital environments, then either we should be able to identify such rhetorical activity through the existing vocabulary of critical inquiry, or we need to develop a new vocabulary for it. We are interested first in investigating to what extent established critical approaches allow us to understand in regards to the persuasive composition of technologies. To pursue this investigation, we turn to rhetorical genre studies and its means of examining typified rhetorical actions and activities. We trace how genres in code produce and reproduce certain norms of values and social action through technology. So to attend to the existence of rhetorical genres in code, we work from an initial hypothesis that code as a form of written communication possesses features of persuasive effort similar to and also entirely distinct from those of more traditional discursive writing. We examine how rhetorical activity unfolds within coding communities as means of creating social action by which software developers persuade one another to code in particular ways toward particular ends. Conventions and values of a development community are instantiated or reinstantiated, challenged and negotiated by persuasive efforts across instantiations of typified protocol-governed practices. Examining code genres is particularly intriguing to us because such genres illustrate persuasion in seemingly arhetorical venues. By attending to them, we can uncover how assorted values and ideologies circulate through the composition and distribution of code. So we began this project by focusing on a set of related software, that is, several spam control modules for the Drupal content management system. Specifically, we looked at CAPTCHA, ReCAPTCHA, CAPTCHA Riddler, and BACHA. We examined multiple versions of each project's releases, as well as discursive commentary about particular code contributions, as this combined body of text illuminates how developers attempt to persuade one another, namely contributing in certain ways to each project and promoting Drupal development more broadly. So digital rhetoric scholarship has been intertwined with rhetorical genre studies at least as far back as Miller and Shepard's 2004 examination of weblogs. However, genre scholars often seem to struggle with questions of genre emergence and change in new media environments. As a result, they primarily focus on discourse genres with few ventures into visual genres or the materiality of genre. Almost no accounts consider underlying technologies themselves as typified and recurrent. Further, rhetoric is still beginning to consider the vast number of communicative modes that operate within and surrounding digital activity, as well as how to explore them, although, as we've heard today, there's already quite a bit of very fascinating stuff occurring. Of these potential modes, the most noteworthy is procedure or computation due to its increasingly ubiquitous presence and significance, but also because it's communicated through written representation as software code. So Aristotle's three genres of rhetorical persuasion, forensic, epideictic, and deliberative, have served rhetorical pedagogy in practice for several millennia, but the publication of Carolyn Miller's Genre of Social Action in 1984 provided genre studies with a rhetorical theory of genre founded on the social action the genre performs, offering important insight into rhetorical practices that shape our social worlds. So in rhetoric, the term genre should be limited to a particular type of discourse classification, a classification based in rhetorical practice and consequently open rather than closed, and organized around situated actions, that is, pragmatic rather than syntactic or semantic. So if we understand genre to be useful for critical rhetorical work, then we should be able to extend the concept to understanding emerging modes of composing, such as programming, as situated and typified rhetorical actions and activities undertaken in response to recurrent situations or exigencies. When code is written, it is not merely ex post facto transcription of an objective material reality onto the screen and into the machine's processor. Instead, composing code involves decisions with rhetorical, epistemic, and ontological consequences. How a program is designed to act, how it's understood to act, and who can or should manipulate it are all concerns that are articulated in various ways in its code. Meaningful communication takes the form of computational logic framed through that code, shaped by the needs and constraints of the communities creating and accessing it. As Donald Knuth has noted, the computer programs that are truly beautiful, useful, and profitable must be readable by people. So we ought to address them to people, not to machines. Kernighan and Plowger and Kernighan and Pike have even authored text on composing code specifically with the intent of improving its readability and clarity for human audiences. So it's significant that many programmers already recognize their work as written communication and not just as an instrument for machine interpretation. While they may not use the vocabulary of rhetorical theory and criticism, they attempt to address rhetorical concerns in order to produce, quote, better code, that is, code successfully compelling humans to understand, accept, and interact with it as valuable and useful through particular ways of reading. So Drupal is a free and open source software application package generally defined as a content management system, a system providing infrastructural support for websites from small personal sites to large-scale corporate implementations. Drupal modules developed by individual and sometimes overlapping communities allow specific Drupal installations to be modified to suit their context and needs, such as the prevention of spam account and content creation. So spam and spam control technologies evolve together. As some anti-spam approaches become ineffective and thus obsolete, there arise opportunities to develop new spam control technologies. One currently popular approach is CAPTCHA, which is an acronym for the Completely Automated Public Turing Test to Tell Computers and Humans Apart, which attempts to determine, based on user input, if a user is human or a software. Multiple CAPTCHA Drupal modules over the course of the last decade have innovated spam prevention and detection, such as by increasing the difficulty for non-humans to respond to tests, such as by obscuring text in response prompt images to full optical character recognition or OCR software, which attempts to discern text within image files, or by asking questions that require contextual knowledge to answer, such as, what is the three-letter abbreviation for the United States of America? We investigate how these modules are marked by recurrent rhetorical situations and typified structures and algorithmic procedures by focusing on 4 Drupal spam control modules: CAPTCHA, reCAPTCHA, CAPTCHA Riddler, and CAPTCHA. So I'll just briefly note this table you can see includes some statistical info about the 4 modules we looked at. CAPTCHA and reCAPTCHA are the 2 most installed and downloaded Drupal security-related modules. OAuth, access control lists, and search configuration are numbers 3, 4, and 5 in the popularity order. So of the 4 modules that we're interested in, CAPTCHA is the oldest, started in 2004, and it serves as a foundation on which reCAPTCHA and CAPTCHA Riddler are built. It's actually an API for other projects as well as a standalone module. And as I noted, CAPTCHA is the single most downloaded and installed security-related module developed for Drupal. CAPTCHA functions by generating a string of data against which user input is compared. There's been considerable persuasive activity among contributors over the last decade concerning how this data is generated, stored in its database, retrieved, presented to the user, and compared against the input string. reCAPTCHA is noteworthy in that it is a Drupal port of a project housed almost entirely within Google's corporate structure. reCAPTCHA uses the Google Maps databases to generate validation tests. Before that, it used validation input to clarify text in Google Books' digital archives. CAPTCHA Riddler differs from the main CAPTCHA module and reCAPTCHA in that there's no randomly generated key against which user input is tested. Instead, CAPTCHA Riddler provides a Drupal administrator with the ability to assign his or her own preferred questions and answers. And then finally, unlike the other modules, CAPTCHA does not function as a CAPTCHA-style module. Instead, it works by hiding input fields from humans and makes them available for spam bot users to complete and thus prove that they're robots. CAPTCHA follows a paradigm common to many contemporary software interfaces, that of Model View Controller, MVC, which model manages application data, a view represents output data provided by the model, and controller manipulates model based on input data. So despite the nature of code as a relatively new form of written communication employed in new and emerging media, and building on Rodolfo and DeVos's notion of rhetorical velocity as a strategy for composition, delivery, and response, we want to argue for what we might consider genre viscosity, or the assorted tendencies of diverse forces within a rhetorical ecology to accelerate or resist the potential for dissemination and recurrent use of an argument or genre. Viscosity reflects rate of change in these assorted code genres within individual projects and also across their larger categorical affiliations and hierarchical strata, such as the individual program, spam control modules, Drupal CMS's platform, the PHP language, and web services and related applications. So each of these modules is comprised of code that, when examined across numerous iterations over time, reveals resistances between the service of Drupal level rhetorical goals and goals unique to each module's development communities. So if the developers of a given module cannot completely reject Drupal imposed constraints that might otherwise be undesirable to them, they can at least articulate their preferences for alternatives through the code for their module or in non-parsed commentary in code files. So broadly, these modules each demonstrate increasingly localized distinctions of code operations, such as the separation of test generation from validation, or the transformation of individual variables into more complex multi-element arrays to facilitate looping, iterative processes of data manipulation. The increase in modularity could suggest a number of persuasive goals. First, this might indicate an anticipation of the growing complexity of a given project, with modular explosions of code avoiding potentially unwieldy or complex functions. Second, it might reflect anticipated vectors of future expansion for the project, regardless of whether these are ultimately pursued and realized by the community. Drupal's top-down influence and imposition of functional and organizational constraints upon individual module developments suggests a high genre viscosity across vertical levels of organizational hierarchy, such that smaller scale agents, third-party communities developing each module, are unlikely to catalyze radical changes in larger scales of the architecture. This viscosity also works against broader acceptance of any non-standard procedural logic used in a single module. Many individual projects, such as those less popular than CAPTCHA or reCAPTCHA, face considerable obstacles in changing community-driven typifications demonstrated via organizational or syntactical changes in code at the Drupal level. For example, CAPTCHA's move to create URLs through the explosion of URL components into separate variables and then make them into an array for a clean recombination of relevant data reflects a top-down desire to promote secure methods of transmitting information to the system's database and prevent malicious injection of outsider code. However, the specific approach employed by CAPTCHA developers resembles little the coding preferences of developers doing similar things in other spam control module communities, but it functions successfully enough for the CAPTCHA community. So that said, individual projects do display varied rates of genre viscosity in influencing developers of other individual modules. Such influence seems due in part to the overall lifespan and popularity of a given project. In 2007, CAPTCHA developers reorganized the module's functionality based on a confluence of events, including numerous individuals developing their own CAPTCHA alternatives and a body of complaints about CAPTCHA's bugginess, and established the module as an API, a framework upon which to build specific CAPTCHA variations without compromising the life of the initial project. In part, this occurred due to the main CAPTCHA developers arguing that others joined forces per core Drupal development values. In part, it was also due to alternative modules forking their projects from CAPTCHA, essentially using pre-existing code as a base while innovating without CAPTCHA reaping any of the rewards of particularly successful endeavors. The consolidation kept efforts more closely associated with one another and gave all involved access to examine and test proposed experiments with validation, security, and so on. By assuming a position as a framework with which others can associate themselves, CAPTCHA has gained a high viscosity, making it more difficult to change how that project or any of its associated modules functions at a fundamental level, although such changes may impact the development of a single application or CAPTCHA principles. This viscosity may differ greatly in the experience of any would-be innovators involved with standalone projects, like the more recently established CAPTCHA module and its model view controller setup. MVC is an incredibly common programming schema outside of, but not within Drupal. Due to this organizational distinction, CAPTCHA has the potential to draw in developers who might dislike Drupal's conventional module structure, which might explain in part the number and frequency of commits to the project. It's one of the newer projects, but it has far more downloads than, say, CAPTCHA Riddler. So over time, changes made to Drupal architecture are given little resistance by individual modules so long as its developers remain motivated to maintain and update them. Changes to the CAPTCHA API similarly face little resistance by its related modules like reCAPTCHA and CAPTCHA Riddler. In the example here on the screen, which may be a little hard to read, it's possible to see changing development values inscribed into reCAPTCHA's code as it's restructured to follow changes in CAPTCHA functionality across major Drupal releases from 5 to 7. Specifically, Contributors demonstrate a turn to functional modularity, which you can see early on when they call for a general variable get function and turn instead to a pre-existing server authentication FSOC open in order to verify connection to reCAPTCHA servers, as well as an increase in the use of arrays rather than separate variables to store related data, and the emergence of explicitly valued Boolean variables when they start setting up specific variables like reCAPTCHA added as false rather than checking whether or not it has a value. So each of these decisions suggests a particular philosophy for approaching the construction and verification of a reCAPTCHA test, understood through the continually changing and variably viscous constraints at the levels of the Drupal platform, the CAPTCHA API, and the larger reCAPTCHA Google Web Service. So these examples demonstrate snapshots in time over the extended lifespan of these modules, and they do not fully reflect the number of relevant contribution attempts, failed excuse me, and successful submissions accepted for inclusion into future code releases, splinter projects or forks, started by those who want to pursue alternative solutions or promote different values, or the surrounding discursive conversations about which changes should be accepted. So genres in code, all of these modules demonstrate both considerable variety and recurrence in the procedural logic comprising their test generation and validation. While these tests themselves have not changed much, each project has over time increased the scope and variety of the implemented security measures surrounding its key generation procedures, such as restricting access to variables and data in the SQL database, setting and flushing individual session ID information, and so on, as a way to establish that project as a reliable and trustworthy module for spam control, but also as a way to promote, through clarification and obfuscation, particular goals for the community to achieve, value, and adhere to or object against. If we want to claim that we're interested in the persuasive capabilities of emerging technologies, then we need to attend further to how the mechanisms of these technologies are communicated, perpetuated, and changed over time through their code by the communities of developers that engage them directly, rather than focusing overwhelmingly on the experiences of end users significantly impacted by the procedural arguments of their development practices. Given that this is still very much a work in progress, we recognize the need to explore these texts in greater detail, as well as the need to examine a far greater set of code texts if we're going to reach stronger conclusions about how computational procedures mark typified persuasive appeals. However, from this preliminary analysis, we suggest the rhetorical concept of genre illustrate important features of typified texts, rhetorical decision-making in coding practices, and where the nexus of stabilization and change in coding practices might be found. Thank you.